I have changed my mind about intuition quite drastically over the last couple of years. Recently, I have been living my life in a way that could be described as guided by something like intuition, guided by something like an inner attunement, much more than I ever thought possible. And also, it's been working really well. But how would I explain this to my younger, very rational and very skeptically minded self? This is an interesting thought experiment to me, and hopefully my attempts of unpacking this or approaching this as I would explain it to my former self who didn't believe that anything like intuition existed can help reach some people who are not already into this and can maybe change your mind or at least shift your perspective a little bit. And of course, I'm making this video also in part because this has really been an upgrade to my life, so I hope it can do the same for you. So, like I said, I used to not believe in intuition. I thought that intuition is either something that doesn't exist at all, or if it does exist in some form, I clearly didn't have any of it. And I had good reasons to be skeptical about the concept of intuition. After all, we know and we can systematically test cognitive biases. This is one of my favorite graphs here, is just like an overview of all the different cognitive biases that we know about. It's fascinating to me that you can expose ways in which we fool ourselves, ways in which we can systematically be wrong while feeling that we're right. And research into cognitive biases just shows us that so much of this is going on. It reminds me of this Richard Feynman quote: "The first principle is you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool." So, like any good skeptical rationalist, my conclusion about intuition was it's probably nothing. Even if there is something like that going on, how could you possibly tell the difference between an intuition where you're right about something and one of the hundreds of ways in which you can just be wrong? How can you tell the difference between a biased thought and intuition? And this part I haven't changed my mind about. This is a very real problem that we need to consider whenever we're talking about anything related to intuition. Not least because of my favorite bias of them all, which is the confirmation bias. You will simply notice things in the world around you that confirm your beliefs and ignore or forget about things that don't confirm your beliefs. Which means it's easy to fool yourself into believing that you're right about things even when you're not. You're simply confirming your own bias. But then I didn't want to be too closed-minded, and instead of discounting the thing entirely, I later shifted my perspective more towards how Malcolm Gladwell proposes intuition in his book Blink, which, if I can give a very brief summary of that idea, would be that yes, something like a gut feeling or an intuition about something can be valid if it is connected to something that you have deep expertise and lots of experience in. So in this case, the gut feeling that you get about something would essentially be the result of loads and loads of subconscious processing and pattern matching. An example given in the book is recognizing whether a painting is an original or whether it is fake. You can imagine that someone who's spent decades investigating this can maybe look at a painting and just get a gut feeling of, nah, I think this is fake, even if they maybe can't explain yet why. And then upon closer investigation, it indeed turns out that that initial instinct was correct. And this could simply be all this kind of pattern matching based on all this experience that happens very quickly, subconsciously, and kind of gives you the right answer. That made sense to me. So that was the new belief I arrived at. Yes, this kind of thing can be trusted, but only if it's connected to something you have loads of experience in. But there's also a downside to that, because sometimes it is that very expertise and experience that actually makes you blind to what's going on. So for example, this is where you are an industry expert somewhere and you miss the next big thing. Someone comes to you with an idea and you say, nah, this is never going to work because it doesn't match any of the patterns of what works in your experience. And sometimes you're right, but sometimes the reason it doesn't match anything in your experience is because this is the next big thing. And if you weren't such an expert, you might be more open to recognizing this is the new direction things are going in. So even with this view, with this model of intuition, it's kind of a toss-up. Is it actually useful or not? It's kind of hard to tell. Now, my view of this has changed, and I do think that there is something like intuition and that it's reliably useful for navigating life. What I don't have is a detailed explanation of how or why this works. But what I do have is a way in which you can test it and find out for yourself quite easily. What changed for me is based on two realizations. The first one is about a yes signal versus a no signal. The way I was thinking about intuition before was that I thought it was about the right answer to something arising from within. So you kind of get a signal of this is the way to go, or you get a yes signal, a positive signal. And it's true that at the time, I definitely struggled to feel anything like that. But what I failed to realize at the time is that there are also no signals. There are the signals that tell you something's wrong. You've somehow gotten out of alignment. And those signals I actually got very strongly. So what does that look like or feel like? Well, it's a feeling of tension. It's a feeling of unease. It's a feeling of like clenching, constriction, and it's a bodily sensation. It's also a bodily sensation that gets stronger the longer I stay off that path, the further away I veer from alignment. So the initial feeling of tension and pressure can be quite subtle, but it can be just like a tensing up, a very subtle tensing up that basically tells me something's not right. And if I ignore that feeling, the feeling that basically says something is out of alignment, and I stay out of alignment, I keep following the path out of alignment, it gets worse and worse and worse, and eventually it's literal physical tension where, it can get so bad that I can barely turn my head, for example. I used to just ignore this, and in part I used to ignore this because I felt like this for so much of my life. I learned to just deal with it and numb myself from it. But nowadays I pay attention to it and it helps me navigate. Here's a specific example in which this is helpful. In relationships, I have always struggled with self-abandonment. So I would get into a relationship with someone and I would kind of lose myself in that relationship. I would be too focused on the other person, and I'd really struggle to take care of myself and my own needs. And in fact, if someone asked me, well, what are your own needs? What do you need? I would come up blank. That's the missing yes signal. I'd be like, I have no idea. But what I would feel is that as I am going along with things that somehow don't feel right, as I'm further and further self-abandoning in the relationship, that tension rises. The feeling of something's wrong keeps getting stronger. I then keep pushing against it. I keep trying to make it work despite whatever is going on. And eventually I can barely stand it and I feel a strong need to escape. What I realize now is that this feeling of tension, of constriction, is a sign that something needs to happen. It doesn't necessarily tell me what needs to happen. It doesn't mean that I immediately know what's wrong, but it tells me something's wrong, something needs to happen. And it's usually that maybe I just need alone time. Maybe I need to bring something up. Maybe there's something that I need to talk about with my partner. There's maybe some need that is not being met. And even if I don't know exactly what that need is, I can start doing something about it. I can notice the tension and I can maybe take time for myself and try and figure it out. Or I can start a conversation and just be like, hey, here's how I'm feeling. Something's not right, and try to explore in the right direction. Based on this no signal, I can start navigating towards the right solution. I can basically end up going the right way by process of elimination. Whatever the thing is that makes me feel the least constricted, the least tense, the least under pressure is probably the right one. I also apply this same thing to my business and my creative work. I really pay attention when something feels tense, when something feels off. That is a sign for me where I want to course correct early before I overcommit to the wrong path and end up super stressed and overwhelmed trying to make something work way further down the line. The changes I've been making in my own businesses and in the way I create content, which I made a separate video about, are largely based on this. I am navigating towards what feels right. The second factor, the second realization that made a difference is what I call the quiet voice of knowing. This has become such a clear difference to me, and I'm really curious if you have a similar experience. So there is the voice in your head, right? Your thinking mind, your verbally thinking mind, the voice in your head, that has a certain quality and a certain tone. And then there is kind of an inner knowing, what I call the quiet voice of knowing, which has a totally different tone and vibe. This is something I've gotten better and better at paying attention to. I've noticed this when it comes to, for example, a failed project. And in fact, I've noticed this same thing in a failed business project and also in failing relationships, where at some point in the process, there will be this sense of knowing. Something inside me goes, this is not going to work out. The thinking mind will then jump in and say, no, this is too soon to decide. And here are we'll make a big plan. Here are the pros and cons. Here's why we need to keep going. And here's the strategic plan. Here are all the reasons, blah, 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 right? It's kind of loud and frantic, and it's coming up with all the facts and reasons and so on and so forth. The voice of knowing is much, much quieter. It's also more like a feeling than words, and it never gets agitated or frantic. If I'm in a difficult situation, let's say I'm working on some project, things are really tough, things are not working out well, we're constantly problem solving. If I ask myself, what do I think about this? And then ask myself, what do I know about this? I will usually get two very different answers. Now, fair warning, when you do this, what might happen is if you go, okay, what do I think about this? The voice in your mind will go blah, 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 blah in a frantic way as usual. And then if you kind of try to drop in and go, what do I know about this? What might happen is that the voice in your mind tries to impersonate that quiet voice of knowing and tries to pretend to be that and goes,
actually what the mind said is totally right.
And you got to ignore that and go, no, what do I know about this from a place that is not my mind and that comes up in a way that isn't the voice of my mind and also isn't the voice of my mind trying to pretend to be something else. This is hard to explain, but it's worth trying to see if you can tap into something like that. Do you also get kind of two different answers? Do you feel that difference in quality? So those are the two things that really changed my mind, where I notice if I pay attention to the signals of misalignment, that clenching, that tension, and navigate by way of elimination, that seems to lead to really good things. And if I'm very clear about what does the voice in my mind sound like versus what does a sense of knowing feel like, that also leads to good outcomes. Now, you could still say, well, what about all the biases? Maybe I am just fooling myself with extra steps. And to that, I would say, yes, that is correct. It's always possible to just be totally delusional. And truly, if you're really delusional, how could you possibly know? However, there is one huge advantage to following this idea as I've laid it out here, which is that you overall just feel a lot better. Okay, quick interjection. The explanation I gave here was a little bit confusing, so let me try again. Let's take the example of using this more intuitive approach to make business decisions. The question is, of course, well, does it work? And one of the ways we can find out is, well, there's an outcome we want to achieve with a business. One of those outcomes is probably we want to make money. And one of the reasons to be skeptical about this whole idea of intuition is because we don't want to be making decisions based on a system that is actually just a form of fooling ourselves, which then ends up in a bad outcome, which is, you don't make money or you go out of business. And had you chosen a different way to make decisions, that wouldn't have happened, right? That is kind of the key problem here. And that is what we're trying to answer if we're asking, well, does this approach work? So with this simple example, using it for business decisions and the outcome, the desired outcome is we want to make money. Does it work? I think there's two things to look at here. The first is that I can say, yes, it seems like this works. I have seen a more intuitive way of making business decisions lead to good business outcomes, as in number goes up, right? The metrics you want to see go up. But then there's still the question of, well, does it work better than something else? And that's a question we maybe can't ever fully answer. You can't like A/B test your own life, right? But I think it's likely that the answer is this way of decision making might not be the one that maximizes that desired outcome. If the desired outcome is make money with the business, is this the best way to make the most money? Probably not, actually. I can imagine that there is a more data-driven, more systematic, like the perfect spreadsheet, basically. You use that to make your decisions, you end up making more money. But why do I want to make money with my business in the first place? I think everybody has different variations of an answer to that. But for me, it has a lot to do with things like freedom and purpose. It's like, yes, it's nice to have money, but beyond the point where I can just pay for all my necessities, it's really all just about, well, do I have freedom? Am I enjoying my life? Am I doing things that matter to me? And there, the perfect spreadsheet might help me make more money with my business, but in a way that compromises other important values to me. It might be that there's ways in which I can exploit my customers to make more money. There's ways in which I can cut corners and cheat the system to make more money. But then, do I want to do that? Do I want to make my money by essentially cheating or deceiving other people? There's maybe ways to make more money by selling a product that I don't really believe in, or selling a product kind of over-promising, being more hypey and basically misleading people more in how I sell it, and then just under-delivering and just being like, yeah, whatever, I have a lot of disappointed customers, but look at all this money. Or there's a way to make more money that actually traps me in my own business because I'm working 12 hours a day and it stresses the hell out of me and it's bad for my health and it's bad for my well-being and so on and so forth. So all of this is to say that when it comes to purely maximizing a metric, I think that a more intuitive approach is probably not better than a different approach. But because this whole approach, the way I'm doing it, is based on paying attention to how do I feel? Like, does this feel good to me? Or does it make me feel tense? Does it add pressure and stress? Or do I kind of feel open and free and expansive? Because that's how I navigate. It means that I am running my business in a way that generally makes me feel more open, more free, lighter, more expansive, which means that my day-to-day experience is that I am having a better time. It's a better experience. It's less stress. I am feeling more free right now, regardless of how much money I make by the end of the month, right? The moment-to-moment experience is giving me some of the maybe intangibles that are very important to me. So that's what I mean when I say the advantage of following a more intuitive approach is that it makes you feel better in the present moment, and feeling better in the present moment is often what we're trying to get by proxy, right? Like I'm doing all this stuff because I want to make all this money because I want to feel better. Well, if I can do something that makes me feel better right now, then I'm already winning. And so even if that doesn't make as much money as absolutely possible, that is still a preferable outcome. I would rather have a good present moment-to-moment experience. I would rather feel like I'm kind of spending my time in worthwhile ways and doing the right thing and generally just feel good in my skin while making some money than compromise all of that stuff to make more money. So this is how and why I've changed my mind about intuition, although I still don't like to use the term intuition. It's a very charged word for me. So I prefer to talk about basically inner alignment, inner wayfinding, this kind of thing. I've also talked about that in a previous video. I'll link to all the related videos below here. But that is how I've changed my mind about what could be called intuition. I'm really curious to hear where you stand on this, and what your ideas about this are. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in a comment below.